Cleaners don't speak in my boardroom. The words landed flat and cold, cutting through the polished silence like a switch flipped off, and for a second no one moved, no one breathed. As if the air itself had been instructed to hold still, Daniel Crawford stood at the head of the 20-foot glass table, cufflinks catching the overhead light, his hand still extended from where he had just dropped the access badge onto the marble floor. The small plastic card skidding once before stopping at the edge of Ava Johnson's worn sneakers. The city skyline stretched behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows, 72 stories up, the late afternoon sun casting long reflections across chrome laptops and untouched bottles of water, and every executive in the room kept their eyes carefully forward, not on her, not on him, but on the invisible line that separated power from everything beneath it. Ava didn't bend to pick up the badge right away, her fingers tightening slightly around the cleaning cloth in her hand, the faint scent of industrial citrus still clinging to it, her posture quiet but unbroken, like someone who had learned long ago that being unseen was sometimes safer than being heard. Except this time, she had already crossed that line, already spoken when she wasn't supposed to, and now the weight of that choice pressed into the stillness around her. Daniel exhaled sharply, a controlled, practiced sound, the kind that signaled impatience more than anger, his pen resting between his fingers, hovering just above the final page of the contract laid open before him, numbers and clauses arranged in tight, legal precision, a deal that had taken months to assemble, a deal that would pull his company back from the edge of a financial slide no one outside this room fully understood, and yet here she was, a cleaner, interrupting the final moment as if she belonged anywhere near it. "You're done here," he added, quieter now, but no less firm, his gaze flicking toward the door as if dismissing a minor inconvenience, something to be removed so the real work could continue. The faint hum of the building's ventilation filled the gap between his words, steady, mechanical, indifferent, and somewhere down the hallway a distant elevator chimed, a reminder that the world outside this room was still moving even as everything inside it remained locked in place. Ava finally lowered her eyes just enough to see the badge at her feet, the name printed in simple black letters, nothing special, nothing powerful, just proof that she was allowed to be in the building at all. And for a brief second her reflection flickered in the glossy floor beside it, small against the vastness of the room. But when she looked up again, her gaze didn't drift, didn't soften. It held, steady and direct, not challenging, not defiant, just certain in a way that didn't match the role she had been given. Daniel's pen tapped once against the paper, a quiet, impatient rhythm, and one of the executives shifted slightly in his seat, the subtle creak of leather sounding louder than it should have in the silence. Outside, sunlight slid across the glass, inching closer to the edge of the table, catching the fine print on the page in a thin band of gold, a detail easy to miss unless you were looking for it, unless you knew exactly where to look. Ava's voice, when it came, was calm, almost too soft for the size of the room, but it carried anyway, threading through the stillness with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore. "If you sign that, you lose everything." The room did not react all at once. It fractured into small, controlled movements, a blink here, a shifted glance there, the faint scrape of a chair leg against polished floor, as if each person present needed a second to decide whether what they had just heard deserved acknowledgement or dismissal, and Daniel Crawford chose quickly, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, his pen no longer tapping but held still between his fingers, suspended above the contract like a decision already made. Ava Johnson did not step forward and did not step back. She simply stood where she was, her shoulders relaxed but grounded, the weight of long nights and quiet routines carried in the way she held herself, a presence shaped by years of being overlooked, by knowing how to exist in spaces where no one expected her to matter. And yet her eyes remained fixed on the page in front of him, not on his authority, not on the room, but on the exact place where the risk lived. "Excuse me," one of the senior partners finally said, his voice careful, almost polite, but edged with disbelief, as if questioning whether the moment itself was real. A low ripple of restrained amusement moved across the table, not loud enough to break decorum, but present enough to signal alignment with power, and someone at the far end leaned back, slightly, folding his arms, watching her with the detached curiosity reserved for interruptions that would soon be corrected. Daniel exhaled through his nose, slow and measured, his gaze lowering to the contract as if her words had not earned his attention, as if silence would erase them. But the sentence lingered, hanging in the air with a weight that did not match its volume. "You heard me," he said without looking up, his tone even, practiced, the voice of someone accustomed to being followed without question. "This is not your place, and this is not your conversation." Ava's grip on the cloth loosened just enough for her fingers to move, and she folded it once, neatly, a small, deliberate action that steadied something inside her, her voice when it returned still calm, still controlled, but now clearer, anchored in something deeper than impulse. Page 14, subsection C, line 3. "It shifts all post-acquisition liability to your side." And this time the words did not float. They landed, precise, measurable, like coordinates placed on a map no one else had examined closely enough. The man nearest to Daniel frowned slightly, his hand moving toward the document, not fully committing, but enough to register that doubt had entered the room, subtle but undeniable. Daniel's pen lowered a fraction closer to the paper, then stopped again, not because he believed her, not yet, but because certainty had been interrupted, and in a room built on control, even a small disruption carried weight. "That clause has been reviewed by legal," he replied, finally lifting his eyes to meet hers, his expression composed but sharper now, the edge of irritation more visible. "You are out of line." Ava did not flinch, did not raise her voice. She simply met his gaze with the same steady focus, the kind that did not demand attention but refused to disappear. "It is written to look standard, but it is not," she said, each word spaced with quiet intention. "If anything goes wrong after you sign, lawsuits, compliance failures, anything, your company takes the fall, and they walk away clean." The silence that followed was different from before, not empty, but dense, filled with the quiet recalculations of people who suddenly were not as certain as they had been seconds ago. And somewhere behind Daniel, the city light shifted again, catching the edge of the contract in a narrow band of brightness, illuminating the exact lines she had named, as if the truth itself had been waiting there, unnoticed, until someone finally chose to say it out loud. Daniel Crawford did not move right away, but something in his posture shifted, subtle, controlled, the kind of change only visible to those trained to read power when it recalibrated. And for the first time since she spoke, his eyes dropped fully to the page instead of past it, his fingers tightening slightly around the pen as he traced the margin without yet committing to the line she had named. Across the table, one of the analysts leaned forward, pulling the document closer with a quiet urgency that did not match the polished calm expected in that room, his thumbs sliding down the page, scanning, stopping, then moving back again as if confirming what he thought he saw. "It is standard language," another executive said quickly, almost too quickly, his voice carrying the weight of prior confidence now beginning to thin. "We have used similar clauses before." But even as he spoke, his gaze flickered down, no longer anchored in certainty. Ava Johnson remained still, her hands now resting lightly in front of her, the folded cloth tucked between her fingers, her breathing steady, measured, as if she had already accepted whatever outcome would follow, because the act itself, the choice to speak, had already been made long before she walked into this room, long before this moment demanded it. Daniel's jaw set as he turned the page back once more, slower this time, his eyes narrowing slightly as he read, not scanning anymore but examining, his attention drawn to the phrasing, the placement, the way the language curved just enough to appear routine while shifting the weight beneath it. And for a brief second the room lost its center, no longer orbiting his certainty, but hovering in the space of doubt she had introduced. "Where did you learn to read contracts like this?" he asked without looking up, his tone quieter now, not softer, but more focused, the question landing somewhere between challenge and calculation. Ava did not hesitate, her answer simple, direct. "I used to study them." And nothing more, no explanation, no defense, just a statement that existed on its own, leaving the rest unsaid but present. A faint sound came from the far end of the table as someone cleared his throat, the kind of small, involuntary reaction that followed the realization that a narrative was shifting, that the person who had been dismissed as background might not belong there after all. Daniel finally lifted his head, his eyes locking onto hers again, searching now, not for defiance, but for inconsistency, for any sign that this was chance or guesswork, something he could dismiss and move past. But what he found instead was stillness, the same grounded certainty that had not wavered since she spoke. And it unsettled something deeper than the contract itself. Security, he said then, the word. Measured, controlled, but carrying enough authority to cut through the tension. And within seconds the door behind Ava opened with authority, only repetition, as if saying it again might restore what had already begun to fracture. Daniel's eyes moved once more across the paragraph, catching the phrasing she had named, the subtle shift in liability, the quiet transfer of consequence buried beneath standard terminology, and for the first time, the possibility that she was right was no longer abstract. It was present, measurable, real. He straightened slightly, his shoulders tightening as he leaned back just enough to create distance from the document, as if stepping back might change what he was seeing. Outside the window, the sun dipped lower, casting a longer shadow across the room, the light now sharper, more angled, cutting across the table and stopping just at the edge of the page, as if drawing attention to it in a way no one could ignore. "Hold on," Daniel said finally, his voice quieter than before, but firm, the tone no longer dismissive, but controlled in a different way, the kind that came when something needed to be reconsidered. A subtle shift moved through the room again, this time not of dismissal, but of recognition, as laptops were turned slightly, documents adjusted, eyes returning to the same place she had pointed to moments earlier. The deal, which had felt inevitable just minutes ago, now hovered in uncertainty, suspended between action and consequence. And in that space, the absence of the one person who had spoken first became impossible to ignore, her words still echoing. In the silence, not as interruption, but as a warning that had not yet finished unfolding. The room tightened around the document as if the air itself had shifted, every set of eyes now anchored to the same block of text that had gone unnoticed for weeks, and the confidence that once filled the space had thinned into something sharper, more cautious. Daniel Crawford leaned forward again, closer this time, his elbows resting lightly against the table as he read the clause word by word, not scanning, not assuming, but dissecting, his mind moving through each phrase, each condition, each implication, and the more he read, the more the structure revealed itself, not as protection, but as exposure. Pull. The comparative version, he said without looking up, his voice low but immediate. And within seconds one of the analysts tapped rapidly on a laptop, pulling up an earlier draft, placing it side by side with the current version on the screen, the contrast subtle but undeniable once seen. That language was not in the previous revision, the analyst murmured, almost to himself, his brow tightening as he scrolled, cross-referencing, confirming. A quiet tension rippled outward, no longer contained. As the realization began to form not as speculation but as fact, and the executives who had dismissed the interruption now leaned in, their posture reflecting a collective recalibration, the shift from assumption to scrutiny. Daniel's hand moved slowly across the page, his finger stopping at the exact line Ava had named, tracing it once, then again, as if testing whether the meaning would change, but it did not. It remained exactly what she had said, a transfer of liability, so precise it almost hid itself in plain sight. He leaned back slightly, the chair beneath him giving a soft, controlled creak, his expression no longer composed in the same way, the edge of irritation replaced by something heavier, something closer to recognition. "Who drafted this revision?" he asked, his eyes lifting toward the far end of the table, and for a moment no one answered, not because they did not know, but because the question itself had shifted from routine to accountability. One of the partners cleared his throat, glancing briefly at the others before speaking. It came from their legal team during final negotiations, and the explanation, once sufficient, now sounded incomplete, as if it belonged to an earlier version of the room, one that no longer existed. Daniel's gaze returned to the document, then to the screen, then back again, the repetition not indecision, but confirmation. A process of removing doubt layer by layer until only fact remained. Outside the window, the light had begun to fade, the skyline turning darker, reflections sharpening against the glass, and inside the room the brightness from the overhead fixtures seemed harsher, more clinical, exposing every detail. Without warmth. "If we sign this," Daniel said slowly, his voice measured but no longer distant, "we assume every post-merger liability." And no one interrupted, no one corrected, because the statement did not need debate. It had already been proven in the silence that followed. The pen that had hovered moments before was now set down deliberately beside the contract, not as hesitation, but as decision, a pause that acknowledged consequence. Across the table, the same partner who had spoken earlier leaned back, exhaling quietly, his confidence replaced by a controlled unease, the kind that came when a near mistake revealed itself just in time. And in that moment, as the room absorbed what had almost happened, the absence of Ava Johnson became heavier than her presence had been, her voice no longer in the room, but her words now embedded in every line of the document. Impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss, and impossible to undo. The contract lay untouched now, the pen resting beside it like a decision that had already been pulled back, and for a moment no one reached for anything, no one spoke, as if the room itself needed time to absorb how close it had come to something irreversible. Daniel Crawford stood still at the head of the table, his gaze no longer fixed on the page, but drifting slightly past it, unfocused, as though the words he had just read were still rearranging themselves in his mind, forming a clearer picture of what had nearly happened under his own authority. The overhead lights hummed softly, a constant, mechanical sound that filled the silence without breaking it, and outside the glass walls, the city had shifted into early evening, the last of the sunlight fading into a muted glow that reflected faintly across the polished surface of the table. One of the executives slowly closed his laptop, the soft click echoing more than expected, not as a signal that the meeting was over, but as a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed, something that could not simply be moved past. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath measured but heavier now, his shoulders settling in a way that suggested not relief, but realization, and his hand moved once across the edge of the contract, not to sign it, but to turn it slightly, as if distancing himself from the version of the decision that had existed minutes ago. Across the room, a junior analyst stared at the screen, the clause still highlighted, the thin band of light reflecting across the text making it impossible to ignore, and the earlier confidence that had filled the room now felt distant, replaced by a quiet, shared understanding that a mistake had nearly been made in plain sight. Daniel's eyes shifted toward the door, the same door that had closed behind Ava Johnson, and for a brief second his expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to register the absence, the space where her presence had been, the voice that had cut through certainty with a single sentence. He did not speak her name, did not acknowledge her directly, but the silence carried it anyway. An unspoken recognition that the most important voice in the room had not belonged to anyone seated at the table. A faint reflection of his own figure appeared in the glass behind him, layered over the darkening skyline, and for the first time since the meeting began, he looked less like a man in control and more like someone standing in the aftermath of a decision he had not yet made. "We pause this," he said finally, his voice steady but quieter than before, not commanding, but deliberate, the kind of tone that marked a shift rather than enforced one, and no one objected, no one questioned. Because the authority of the moment no longer needed to be asserted, it had already been altered. Papers were gathered slowly, screens dimmed, chairs adjusted with soft movements that avoided drawing attention, as if each person present understood that the room they were leaving was not the same one they had entered. Daniel remained where he was as the others began to move, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, his eyes returning once more to the contract, then lifting again, toward the door, and in that quiet, suspended space between action and reflection, the truth settled fully, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, that the decision he had almost made had been stopped not by power, not by process, but by a voice he had chosen to dismiss. The hallway outside the boardroom felt different from the inside, quieter, less controlled, the polished marble stretching in long, reflective lines under soft ceiling lights, and Ava Johnson walked through it at a steady pace. Her footsteps light but deliberate, the folded cleaning cloth still in her hand, her badge no longer clipped to her uniform but resting in her pocket, as if the building itself had already decided she no longer belonged to it. Behind her, the heavy doors remained closed, sealing in the tension she had left behind. But the weight of that room did not follow her. It stayed there, contained, while she moved forward into a space that felt simpler, more honest, even in its silence. She did not look back, not because she was unaware of what she had done, but because she had learned that some moments did not need witnessing to matter. They carried their own consequence whether anyone acknowledged them or not. Down the hall, a janitorial cart stood parked against the wall, a bucket of water reflecting the overhead lights in small ripples, and she reached it without hesitation, setting the cloth back in place with the same quiet care she had always shown, her movements precise, routine, grounded in something steady that had nothing to do with boardrooms or contracts. Inside the room she had left, the realization continued to settle, deeper now, more complete. As Daniel Crawford stood alone for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes still drawn to the door, the absence on the other side of it no longer abstract but specific, tied to a voice he could not dismiss anymore. He moved then, slowly at first, then with more intent, stepping away from the table, the sound of his shoes against the floor measured, controlled, but carrying a different weight than before, not authority, but urgency. One of the executives looked up as he passed, as if expecting instruction, but none came. Only a brief glance, enough to signal that the center of the moment had shifted elsewhere. The hallway opened before him, long and quiet, the distant hum of elevators and muted office noise replacing the intensity of the boardroom. And for a brief second he paused at the threshold, his hand resting against the doorframe, not out of hesitation, but recognition, as if crossing into this space required something different from him than what he had brought into the meeting. Farther down, Ava continued her work, wiping down a glass panel with slow, even strokes, the reflection of the city lights beginning to appear faintly in the surface as evening settled in. And when Daniel stepped into the corridor, the distance between them felt larger than it was, not measured in feet, but in everything that had just happened. He watched her for a moment, not announcing himself, not interrupting, just observing, as if trying to reconcile the image before him with the one he had dismissed only minutes earlier. And in that quiet, unguarded space, the truth became fully visible, not in the contract, not in the room behind him, but in the simple, steady way she continued her work, unchanged, unaffected by the power that had tried to silence her. And for the first time since the meeting began, Daniel Crawford did not speak immediately, because whatever he said next would no longer come from authority, but from something he was only just beginning to understand. Daniel Crawford stopped a few steps behind her, close enough to see the faint streaks of water on the glass she was cleaning, close enough to hear the soft rhythm of the cloth moving in slow, even passes, but not close enough to interrupt it without intention. And for a moment he said nothing, because the words he was used to using no longer felt appropriate in this space. Ava Johnson did not turn immediately, but she was aware of him, the slight shift in the air, the presence behind her that carried weight even in silence. And after one more steady stroke across the glass, she lowered her hand, letting the cloth rest lightly against the surface before finally turning to face him. The reflection of the city lights framed them both in the panel between them, his figure sharp, defined, hers softer but steady, and neither of them spoke for a second that stretched longer than expected. Daniel's posture had changed. The rigid authority, replaced by something more measured, his shoulders no longer squared in command but held in quiet control, as if he was choosing each movement instead of assuming it. "You saw it before anyone else," he said finally, his voice lower than it had been in the boardroom, not diminished, but grounded, the tone of someone acknowledging a fact rather than asserting dominance. Ava met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, not defensive, not proud, simply present, and she gave a small nod. Not as validation, but as confirmation. The hallway remained quiet around them, the distant hum of the building continuing as it always did, indifferent to the shift unfolding within it. Daniel glanced briefly toward the floor, then back to her, as if recalibrating the space between them. "Why did you speak up?" he asked, the question simple on the surface, but carrying something deeper beneath it, something that had not been asked in the room where it should have been. Ava's fingers adjusted slightly around the cloth, a small movement that anchored her before she answered, her voice steady, clear. "Because it was wrong," she said, without emphasis, without hesitation, the kind of answer that did not seek approval or reaction. Daniel absorbed that, the simplicity of it, the absence of negotiation or strategy, and for a moment he did not respond, as if the answer itself required more from him than he had expected. He exhaled quietly, his gaze shifting once more to the glass panel, catching both their reflections side by side, the contrast no longer defined by position, but by perspective. "You could have stayed quiet," he said after a pause, not as accusation, but as acknowledgement of the easier path that had not been taken. Ava's expression did not change, but there was a subtle firmness in her voice when she replied, "So could everyone else." And the words settled between them with a clarity that did not need elaboration. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but full, carrying the weight of recognition, and Daniel nodded once, a small, deliberate motion that marked a shift not just in understanding, but in responsibility. "Come with me," he said then, not as an order, but as an invitation, the difference subtle but unmistakable. And when he stepped back, creating space instead of closing it, Ava hesitated for just a fraction of a second before placing the cloth back onto the cart, her movements as steady as before turning to follow, the hallway stretching ahead of them, quiet, unchanged, even as something within it had just been rewritten. They walked in silence down the corridor, the sound of their footsteps soft against the polished floor, neither rushed nor hesitant, just steady, as if the moment itself did not need to be forced forward. Daniel Crawford pushed open a glass door leading into a smaller office space, one he rarely used, away from the main boardroom, quieter, more contained, and he stepped aside slightly, allowing Ava Johnson to enter first. A gesture small but deliberate, the kind that would have gone unnoticed before, but now carried meaning. Inside, the room was simple, a desk, 2 chairs, a wide window overlooking the city now glowing with evening lights, the skyline reflecting back in layers of glass and shadow. And for a moment they both stood without speaking, the distance between them no longer defined by position, but by the shift that had already taken place. Daniel moved to the desk and placed the contract down, not as a decision waiting to be made, but as something already resolved, his hand resting on the edge of it before he looked up at her, his expression composed, but no longer guarded in the same way. "You were right," he said, the words direct, without embellishment, without hesitation, and in the quiet of the room, they carried more weight than any authority he had used before. Ava did not react immediately, her posture remaining calm, her hands relaxed at her sides, as if acknowledgement was not something she had been waiting for, but something she accepted without needing to hold on to. Daniel glanced briefly at the document, then back at her. "That clause would have cost us everything," he continued, his voice measured, not dramatic, just precise, the kind of clarity that came only after doubt had been removed. The city lights outside flickered faintly against the glass, reflecting across the surface of the desk, and for a moment the room felt suspended, separate from everything else in the building. "I made a mistake," he added after a pause, the sentence quieter, but no less certain, not an excuse, not a justification, just a statement of fact, and he did not look away when he said it. Ava met his gaze, her expression unchanged, steady, not dismissive, not forgiving, simply present, and after a brief silence she nodded once, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement that the truth had been spoken. Daniel stepped back slightly from the desk, creating space again, the same shift he had made in the hallway, no longer closing distance through authority, but allowing it to exist. "I want you to stay," he said, his tone even, careful. "Not as a cleaner," he added, the words placed with intention, "but as someone who saw what no one else did." And for the first time, there was no command in his voice, only an offer. The air in the room remained still, carrying the weight of what had just been said, and Ava's eyes moved briefly to the contract, then back to him, not with surprise, but with quiet consideration, as if measuring the meaning behind the words rather than the words themselves. Outside, the last traces of daylight had disappeared, leaving only the glow of the city against the dark glass. And inside, the reflection of both of them stood side by side, no longer divided by the roles they had walked in with. Ava took a slow breath, the kind that settled more than just the moment, and then she stepped forward slightly, not closing the distance entirely, but enough to signal that something had shifted. She did not smile, did not speak right away, because the silence between them already carried what needed to be understood, and in that quiet, with nothing left to prove and nothing left to hide, the room held still, not in tension, but in something steadier, something that did not need to be said out loud, because